Dead America. Tales from the Front Lines. Arizona Caravan. By Derek Slayton. Chapter 1. Day 0 plus 13. The sun hung high in the sky as the giant tractor-trailer rolled down the desolate stretch of road in the High Plains area of Arizona. The only indication of their proximity to civilization was a road sign that read Springerville, 10 miles. At nearly 7,000 feet above sea level, the air was thin, but the view outside the truck windows resembled a desert, vast fields of nothing but dirt, with mountain peaks on the distant horizon. The past few days had been grueling for the three men inside the cab. Normally, the drive from Albuquerque to their destination should have taken 4 to 5 hours. But in the midst of the zombie apocalypse, nothing was normal. Within an hour, they had their first brush with trouble, rolling through a pack of zombies they couldn't avoid. Although the undead posed no immediate threat, a couple of them ended up wedged into the wheel wells, causing a half-day delay. Finding fuel on the open road had proven challenging. Their first 3 stops yielded nothing, despite venturing off the beaten path. Someone or something was siphoning off the fuel supply efficiently, leaving them stranded for miles without a drop to spare. Normally, a full tank would have carried them to their destination in Indian Pines. But with all the detours and stops, their situation grew increasingly dire. Chuck, a surly professional truck driver with a few gray hairs, tapped the gauge on the dashboard and commented, "We're running on fumes." Private Wallace, with a glimmer of hope in his voice, asked, "We can't be that far from Indian Pines, can we?" However, Private Palmer dashed those hopes, shaking his head and saying, "According to the map, it's another 40 miles or so on the other side of Springerville." "I'm guessing those fumes aren't going to carry us that far," Wallace replied, his disappointment evident. Chuck shook his head and said, "Maybe if we unhooked the trailer, we could make it. But even then, it would be close." Wallace knew that disconnecting the trailer wasn't an option. The zombie apocalypse had been raging for only a couple of weeks, and plans were in motion to ensure as many people as possible survived. Wallace and Palmer had been part of the assault group that raided a supercenter distribution center a few days ago, and this caravan was the second part of their mission. The military had somehow located pockets of civilians who had set up strongholds across the country. But to survive the upcoming winter, they needed supplies, medicine, non-perishable foods, and materials to grow their own food. Wallace was fairly certain they even had one of those gaudy wooden cutouts of an old lady bending over to place in the gardens. Their thoughts were interrupted as Chuck spoke up. "Palmer, is there any indication of how big Springerville is on that map of yours?" Palmer replied, "No clue. But they took the time to list it on the map, so you have to figure there's some semblance of civilization." "Let's hope it's big enough to have a gas station then," Chuck concluded. The truck sputtered and chugged along, and all 3 men held their breath, hoping to reach town without running out of fuel. Finally, the truck stabilized, but Chuck's expression showed the gravity of their situation. They continued on, remaining tense over the next few miles, silently praying that the fuel would hold out long enough to reach a gas station. The town of Springville came into view on the horizon, and the 3 of them let out a sigh of relief. Even if they ran out of fuel, they could make it to town without much effort. Their relief, however, was short-lived as they noticed movement in the streets ahead. It was unclear how many, but enough to prompt Chuck to stop the truck about a mile outside of town. Wallace asked, "What are you doing, Chuck? We can't afford to be burning fuel." Chuck switched off the engine, plunging the cab into eerie silence, and explained, "I'm not going anywhere until I know exactly where I'm going. That town looks too big for us to drive around looking for a gas station that we aren't even sure exists. And with the fuel the way it is, I don't want to run out in the middle of a mob." Palmer added, "Chuck is right. Cleaning those things out of the wheel wells was bad enough. Don't want to have that on our plate on top of being surrounded." Wallace reluctantly agreed, saying, "Yeah, you're right. Doesn't mean I have to be happy about it, though." Palmer suggested, "We'll go check out the town. You stay in the cab and stay warm." Chuck chuckled, drawing curious looks from the soldiers. Wallace asked, "What's so funny?" "I've always been classified as essential personnel," Chuck said with a grin. "Just think it's funny that it took the apocalypse for me to finally be treated like it." Both soldiers chuckled as they gathered their gear, and Palmer opened the door, revealing the biting cold. They put on their insulated jackets, slung their rifles over their shoulders, and Palmer pulled out a radio, holding it up to Chuck, who responded in kind. As they began to walk, Wallace pulled out a pair of binoculars and focused on the main road leading into town. Palmer asked, "How bad is it?" Wallace sighed as he saw dozens of zombies roaming the streets, searching for a target. "Well, we've seen worse," Wallace said. Palmer quipped, "We spent 2 days camped out on top of a supercenter as 10,000 of those things swarmed below us. So that answer doesn't exactly narrow it down." Wallace adjusted his shoulders, a nonchalant shrug as he passed the binoculars over to his comrade. Palmer peered through the lenses, nodding with a sense of agreement. "Yeah, that's doable. Unless we find enough fuel, this is going to be a one-way trip," Palmer said. "Hell, even if we do find fuel, I say we make this a one-way trip," Wallace said. Palmer's tone grew somber as he questioned, "You want to abandon the mission?" Wallace hesitated, choosing his words carefully, not wanting to irk Palmer. "I mean," Private Wallace stammered, "we've already killed hundreds of those things." A playful smile cracked on Palmer's face as he reassured, "Relax, Wallace. I'm 100% with you. I was just hoping you had a good reason." Wallace searched for the right words before saying, "Well, did I?" Palmer burst into laughter. "Oh, hell yeah, you did," he admitted. "I mean, you could have said we should quit because it was Tuesday, and I would have agreed with you," Palmer said through the laughter. As the laughter subsided, the two men shared a common thought. Private Wallace wondered aloud, "Is it Tuesday?" Private Palmer chuckled, "Who the hell knows anymore? All I know is we're one raid on a small town away from retirement." Wallace concurred, "That works for me." They exchanged a celebratory fist bump before resuming their march towards town. Half a mile out, they glanced through the binoculars again, observing the town's buildings. Palmer asked, "See any gas stations?" Wallace replied, "No, just regular businesses." Palmer quipped, "Any restaurants?" Wallace quipped back, "I'm going to venture a guess and assume they're closed on account of all the zombies." Palmer, with a smirk, remarked, "Clearly, you've never worked in the service industry. A zombie apocalypse isn't a reason to call out." Wallace chuckled as he continued scanning the area. Finally, he spotted a small sign at the first intersection. "Got something," Wallace said. The sign featured an image of a gas pump with an arrow pointing to the right. He handed the binoculars over to Palmer. "Sign on the right at the intersection," Wallace pointed out. Palmer spotted it and nodded, saying, "We're in business, and we can take the scenic route around town." The two men veered off the road, walking along the frozen tundra around the town's outer edge, keeping a safe distance to avoid alerting the nearby zombies. As they walked, they gazed out over the desolate landscape. The snow-capped mountains in the distance painted a serene backdrop. Palmer turned philosophical. "It's funny how deceiving perspective can be." Wallace, baffled, asked, "What in the hell are you rambling on about?" Palmer explained, "I mean, think about it. If you just looked out that way, you'd think the world is a beautiful place filled with hope. But if you turn around, you'd see the world for what it is. Dangerous, dirty, and not some place you'd want to live in." Wallace stared at Palmer for a moment. "What? I'm trying to be profound," Palmer said, responding to the stare down. "You're being a profound numbnuts. Does that count?" Wallace fired back. Palmer shook his head and playfully flipped his friend off, prompting laughter from both of them. Continuing their walk, they enjoyed the tranquility and the view until they approached the gas station. Wallace pulled out the binoculars to inspect the site, but disappointment washed over him. "Damn, so much for this being an easy day," he muttered. Handing the binoculars to Palmer, they both observed 20 creatures loitering around the front of the station. Some focused on the store, while others wandered around the pumps and a car parked beside one of them. Palmer reassured, "Nothing we can't handle." Wallace agreed, "I'm aware of that. I was just hoping to roll in, fill up, and be on our way." Palmer reminded him, "We have a couple of 100 rounds between us, and it's not like we have to save them because this is our retirement party." Wallace smirked. "True. Better get Chuck on standby." Palmer nodded and activated the radio, speaking into it. "Chuck, you copy?" A voice crackled in response. "Found us some fuel?" Palmer relayed the information. "Found the station. You hang a right at the first intersection, and it's half a mile or so up. We're going to clear it out and get the generator going. As soon as we do, you need to haul ass down here." Chuck's voice came through, determined. "Won't take me more than a couple of minutes to get there. I'll be waiting on your call." Palmer turned off the radio, and both men drew their rifles, ready for action. "We move quick. Don't worry about the noise. Just mow these things down. Once we're clear, you get inside to the pump switch, and I'll handle the generator out back," Palmer said. Wallace nodded, determination in his eyes. "Works for me." The two men exchanged a fist bump, and with rifles in hand, they headed towards the gas station, ready to confront the undead menace. Chapter 2. The two soldiers moved with deliberate ease toward the gas station, their steps devoid of any sense of urgency. Weeks of relentless combat against the undead had eroded the initial fear that had once gripped them. The transformation of the agile runners into sluggish shamblers had played its part, but their overwhelming firepower had certainly helped too. Reaching the edge of the gas station's parking lot, which bordered the outskirts of town, they found themselves on the paved ground. Several zombies near the pumps took notice, their lifeless eyes fixated on the newcomers. Casually, the soldiers raised their rifles, methodically selecting targets and squeezing the triggers. Bullets whizzed through the air, shattering skulls and sending the undead to the ground in lifeless heaps. The thundering gunshots captured the attention of the zombies around the store. Like a Mukabru ballet, they turned in unison and started their slow, aimless march toward the soldiers. But the soldiers remained unfazed. They didn't panic or seek cover. Instead, they stood their ground, their precise marksmanship cutting a deadly path through the oncoming mob. The undead horde quickly succumbed to the relentless onslaught. As swiftly as the attack had begun, it ended, leaving a gruesome pile of zombie corpses strewn across the parking lot. Both men reloaded their rifles, taking care to stow away magazines with only a few rounds left. Their attention now turned to the main part of town, where a couple of 100 zombies were headed in their direction, still a fair distance away. Private Wallace voiced their dilemma, his tone serious. "We're going to have to do something about that mob." Private Palmer replied, "They're easily 5 minutes out, maybe more." Wallace nodded. "We're still going to have to divert them away from the road if Chuck is going to get the truck to us." Palmer surveyed the car parked beside a pump, ensuring that the creatures surrounding it were lifeless. Confirming it was empty, and with the keys in the ignition, he glanced at the fuel gauge, which displayed a mere 1/8 of a tank. "Does it have gas?" Wallace inquired. Palmer replied, "Enough to get us where we need to be, but not much further than that." "Let's get the station operational, then we'll start the diversion," Wallace said. With a nod of agreement, both men set off to complete their respective tasks. Wallace approached the store, observing a couple of zombies inside, lying on the ground, their decaying forms pressed against the glass. That explains why they were so focused on getting inside, he murmured to himself. Taking careful aim, he fired a couple of rounds through the glass, ending the hunger of the undead with precise headshots. He then tested the front door, finding it locked. Unfazed, he shot a couple of rounds into the glass panel at the bottom, weakening it enough for him to kick it in and open the lock. Inside the store, he heard frantic banging from the back. Setting his senses on edge, he cautiously moved towards the source of the noise, but saw no immediate threat. "Looks like you were able to lock up whatever did that to you," Wallace remarked, to the creatures on the floor, their legs mangled and missing chunks of flesh. He inspected the gruesome damage before pondering how many of these creatures had been inside. He quickly pushed the thought aside, knowing that time was of the essence. As he awaited the generator to start, allowing him to activate the pumps, he made his way to the cooler, relieved to find it fully stocked. "Please have it. Please have it," Wallace whispered, his eyes lighting up as he spotted his favorite energy drink. He eagerly grabbed it, but was startled as a zombie slammed against the cooler's rear end. Jumping back in surprise, Wallace nearly knocked himself down, causing a commotion with the nearby candy rack. Fumbling with his weapon for a moment, he realized the ghouls were trapped inside the cooler. He took a moment to steady himself before grabbing his energy drink and one for Palmer before shutting the glass door, sealing the creatures inside for good. Cracking open his drink and savoring the first sip, he quipped, "Okay, Palmer, you better hurry up and get the power going, or else your drink isn't going to still be here." Meanwhile, Palmer made his way to the back of the building, keeping a vigilant eye out for any threats. Dispatching a couple of zombies caught in the fencing, he finally spotted the generator, a small wooden box tucked in the far corner. "That's gotta be it," Palmer thought as he hurried over, cautiously checking for any unexpected guests. Confident in his safety, he inspected the box and found a padlock on it, though it was unlocked. "That's not a good sign," Palmer muttered before removing the padlock and opening the box. Inside, he discovered the generator along with a handwritten note, encased in a plastic bag and duct taped to the device. Frustration welled up within him as he read the note aloud. "Replacement ignition switch ordered. Son of a bitch." He rushed back to the front of the building, where Wallace was perched on the counter, sipping his energy drink. "Where's the power?" Wallace inquired. Palmer handed over the note while accepting the offered energy drink. "In a warehouse somewhere waiting to be shipped out to us." Wallace read the note before tossing it aside, his frustration matching Palmer's. "What the hell do we do now?" "Hope that there's another gas station in town," Palmer replied. Wallace leaped down from the counter, determined to find any indication of another station owned by the same people, which was common for small, out-of-the-way towns. Palmer, meanwhile, gazed out the window, watching the approaching mob. "How long we got?" Wallace asked. 3 minutes, max, Palmer replied, the time ticking away in the face of the oncoming danger. Wallace's frantic search inside the store yielded a stroke of luck as he stumbled upon business cards for the gas station. His eyes widened as he picked one up and saw 2 addresses listed on it. "Got it," he exclaimed, rushing over to hand the card to Palmer, who nodded in approval. "That's great, but any clue where this is?" Palmer inquired. Wallace shook his head. "Nope." Palmer contemplated their next move. "We know there's another station in town that's good enough for me. I'm going to assume that the owner was a smart businessman, so it's probably on the other side of town," Wallace speculated. Palmer agreed. "That's a hell of a hike." "But thankfully, someone left us a ride," Wallace pointed out, indicating the car in the parking lot. Palmer acknowledged with a nod. "Let Chuck know what we're doing, and we're on the road," Wallace instructed. Palmer pulled out the radio, clicking it on. "Chuck, this station is a no-go. Repeat, it's a no-go. Generator is busted." "So what the hell are we doing?" Chuck replied. There's another station in town. Just have to find it, Palmer said. I'm standing by for when you do, Chuck replied. With the radio back in his pocket, Palmer smacked Wallace on the arm. Come on, let's take a drive around town. Wallace nodded, and the two of them downed the rest of their energy drinks, tossing the cans aside before rushing out the door to the waiting car. Palmer took the wheel and Wallace settled into the shotgun seat. Palmer took a deep breath, muttering hopeful words to himself before turning the key. Wallace couldn't hear what he said, but it seemed to work as the car sputtered to life, overcoming the effects of weeks of idleness. Good Lord, how old is this thing? Wallace remarked. Palmer chuckled. It's not the years, it's the mileage. He gestured toward the odometer, which read well over 200,000 miles. Wallace shook his head in disbelief. Honestly, I'm kind of surprised that it started at all, Wallace admitted. Palmer added, so much for just plowing right through them. At this point, you should probably take it easy going over speed bumps, Wallace joked. Palmer reached over and clicked on the heater, which was blowing out cold air, but was at least working. Let's hope they didn't blow all the money on the heat and saved some for the shocks, Palmer quipped. The banter was interrupted as Palmer threw the car into drive and peeled out of the parking lot. Instead of turning toward town and the approaching creatures, he steered the car in the opposite direction, towards the tundra they had recently traversed. What are you doing, Palmer? Wallace questioned. Those gunshots drew those things towards the station. I'm hoping it was enough to clear the main strip, Palmer replied. Both men jostled inside the car as it bounced along the uneven terrain. Palmer gripped the wheel tightly to stay in control, while Wallace struggled to fasten his seatbelt. The rough ride continued as they sped along the outskirts of town, keeping their eyes on the road while countless creatures headed toward the station they were leaving behind. After several minutes of bumpy travel, they reached the main road. Palmer turned the wheel sharply and skidded to a stop. Wallace released his death grip on the handle above the door and took a moment to shake off the violent ride. You just couldn't give me 2 seconds to get my seatbelt, Wallace teased. Palmer brushed off the comment and pointed ahead. Stop your whining. You're fine. Besides, look. Wallace followed Palmer's gaze and couldn't help but smile. Clear sailing, he observed. Let's go find us a gas station, Palmer declared. Chapter 3. The car sped down the main road through town, only slowing when it reached the first intersection. Palmer eased off the gas just before it, hoping to limit the engine noise as they coasted across the cross street. They scanned both ways as they passed through the intersection. Wallace spotted the majority of the mob shambling toward the first gas station, while Palmer noticed a smattering of creatures attempting to enter a few of the buildings. Private Palmer broke the silence, his voice low. Either there are survivors down there, or more of those things are locked inside. Private Wallace responded, his tone equally hushed. I'm betting the latter. They continued driving up the street, employing the same trick to keep the engine noise down as they crossed the intersections. Both men stared hard, trying to find any indication of where the other gas station could be. What was the name of the street we're looking for? Palmer asked. Wallace dug through his pocket for the business card, finally finding it. Buckner Street. The place is in the 100 block of it. So most likely on the outskirts of town again, Palmer remarked. We probably should have thought of that before just rushing headlong into town, huh? Wallace chuckled. Yeah, something hindsight. Both men shared a chuckle at their eagerness overshadowing rational thinking as they continued driving through town. Wallace couldn't help but express his frustration. This town can't be that big. It shouldn't be this hard to find it. The duo reached the outskirts of the business district, which extended for 4 blocks before they found a small neighborhood just ahead. They knew the gas station wasn't there, as it was only 4 more blocks before the edge of town, but they didn't see much movement either. They stopped in the middle of the road, looking in all directions, still not seeing any indication of their target. "What do you think? Make a turn or head to the end of the road," Palmer inquired. "Doesn't look too bad up ahead. Might as well run it out. Might get lucky with the street," Wallace suggested. Palmer nodded, and they continued, driving through the neighborhood. As they went, several zombies emerged from behind houses, shuffling toward them, but still too far away to pose a real threat. Both men focused on the street signs as they drove, stopping at the end of the road just before the tundra began again. "I didn't see Buckner. Did you?" Palmer asked. "Nope, I got nothing," Wallace replied. "What do you think? Hang a left and move away from the first one," Palmer suggested. Wallace agreed. As good a plan as any. Palmer made the turn down the final road in town, moving along the outer edges. He had to weave in and out around the road as they drew the attention of several creatures. Then, Palmer misjudged a cut, and the car bounced violently as one of the zombies vanished underneath the front wheels of the car. A moment later, there was a horrific sound coming from the back as every warning light that still had a working bulb lit up. Palmer hit the gas as hard as he could, and there was a horrific screeching sound coming from the back. The car lurched forward a few feet several times before it locked up completely. Wallace looked out the side mirror, seeing legs sticking out from the back wheel well. "Well, I think we're on foot." Palmer looked at the mirror before banging his head on the steering wheel a few times. "Damn it. Easiest thing in the world to dodge these things, and somehow I fuck it up." His self-loathing was short-lived as a zombie smacked its hands against the driver's side window, startling him. As he drew his handgun, Wallace looked around, spotting several more closing in quickly. "Shoot him and let's move," Wallace urged. Palmer rolled down the window ever so slightly, just enough to get the barrel of his handgun on the other side before pulling the trigger, not wanting to send shattering glass towards them. The back of the zombie's head exploded just before the two of them exited the vehicle. Once clear, they raised their rifles and kept them trained on the approaching zombies, who were no more than 10 yards away. "Just move up the road. The more we fire, the more attention we're going to get," Wallace advised. The two turned and started running up the road, not worried about their footsteps on the pavement as they were already being pursued. As they got up to the next intersection and looked around, they spotted a couple of dozen zombies coming out from around the houses, shambling towards them. As they stood there, deciding their next move, Palmer looked up at the street sign. "Son of a bitch." Wallace looked over to Palmer, concerned, but he relaxed as his partner was just pointing up at the road sign. "Buckner." He gave it a closer look, seeing that they were on the 900 block. So close, yet so far. "Get to the grass and let's double time it," Palmer suggested. Wallace nodded, and the two soldiers started running as hard as they could through the grass, leaving the mob behind them. They got a couple of blocks up as the moans behind them began to intensify. Up ahead, they spotted even more ghouls, but they weren't too concerned as there were a couple of dozen spread out thinly. "I hate being popular," Palmer remarked. "We need to distract them," Wallace proposed. "It's nothing we can't handle," Palmer replied. "That's a lot of wasted ammo, and we're going to need time at the gas station once we get there," Wallace pointed out. Palmer considered it for a moment before nodding agreement. "What did you have in mind?" Wallace thought for a moment before pointing to a house on the corner. "The house. Let's go." Wallace led the duo over to the house, going right up to the front door and kicking it as hard as he could. The door didn't budge, causing Wallace to hop on one leg for a moment as pain shot throughout his body. "Son of a bitch." Palmer shook his head, grabbed the knob, and turned it. The door opened right up. "It's painfully obvious you've never lived in a small town." "Painfully is definitely one way to describe it," Wallace replied. Palmer slung his rifle over his shoulder, drawing his handgun and knife before stepping inside the house. He moved swiftly through the house, his senses sharp, listening for noise and looking for trouble. It didn't take him long to find it. As he turned the corner from the living room into the main hallway, he spotted a zombie shambling towards him. Palmer stepped forward, swinging the knife down with precision, embedding it in the top of the zombie's skull. The creature crumpled to the ground, lifeless. He continued through the single-story house, making sure it was clear which it was. Palmer returned to the kitchen, where Wallace was busy searching through the cabinet below the sink. "We're clear. And what in the hell are you looking for?" Palmer inquired. Wallace, focused on his task, responded just a few common household items that, when combined and put under some light pressure, will create a nice explosion. "You want to blow the place up?" Palmer raised an eyebrow. Wallace shook his head as he set several containers on the counter. "I would if I could, but that stove looks like it's electric. If it were gas, we would already be on the way. But what I'm making will be just as loud, just sadly, without the devastation." "Anybody ever tell you that you're a madman?" Palmer chuckled. "Just my mother and my 12th grade chemistry teacher. Of course, given that I had to take my senior photo without eyebrows. Maybe they had a point," Wallace replied with a grin. Palmer chuckled along with him before noticing that the curtains in the front of the house were still open. He moved to close them, but Wallace stopped him. "I know what you're doing, and leave them open. We want to draw those things our way. In fact, break out the glass. I want the sound to travel as far as it can," Wallace instructed. Palmer nodded, going to the front room and using the butt of his rifle to crack open the windows. He broke out a few of them, then leaned out and let out a loud whistle. "Yeah, we're over here. Come on," Palmer called out. He watched as more zombies shambled toward the house. "Should I open the front door for them?" Palmer asked. Wallace paused his mixing, running over to the back window to assess the situation. "Yeah, we're clear back here. Open it up and get over here. I'm nearly done." Palmer did as instructed, opening the front door and looking outside. A few dozen zombies stepped onto the yard, letting out excited moans at the sight of fresh meat. Palmer didn't wait around, retreating into the kitchen where Wallace was sealing up a container with tape. "What the hell is in that anyway?" Wallace chuckled, keeping his secrets. "If I told you my recipe, then you'd be on a government list." Palmer laughed and shook his head. "Okay, crazy person, come on, company is about to arrive." The two of them sneaked out the back door, shutting it behind them. They started running through the backyard, retreating a block before moving in the direction of the gas station. As they got another block away, there was a loud noise ripping through the air. The explosion didn't create a fireball, but it was enough to rattle the windows of the house they were standing beside. "Christ. Wallace, you sure you didn't blow up the house?" Palmer joked. "Nah, no flames or nothing, so don't have to worry about burning the house down. I call it the pants shitter," Wallace replied. "Classy," Palmer commented. "It's an accurate description. Doesn't really cause any lasting damage, unless you consider staining lasting. Used it against this kid in school who used to bully me," Wallace explained. "Did he shit his pants?" Palmer chuckled. "Oh, I didn't target him. I put it in his dad's garage. Not only scared him, but did a number on his vintage muscle car," Wallace admitted. "You destroyed the paint job on a muscle car? You know, that's a sin, right?" Palmer teased. "You try getting a toilet swirly every day and see if you care what collateral damage there is," Wallace retorted. "Fair enough. Did it work, though?" Palmer asked. The bully came to school the next day, not looking like he had a good night. So I went up and whispered to him that if he touched me or my friends again, the next one was going in the car. I'm pretty sure he dropped out of school not too long after, Wallace recounted. "Remind me to stay on your good side," Palmer joked. "You damn well better," Wallace said, grinning. Both of them chuckled as they continued to move up through the yards. Staying clear of the roads, they saw several creatures shambling towards their explosion trap, which put their minds at ease a bit. The duo managed to avoid contact with the enemy as they reached the edge of town, stopping beside a house on the corner to ready their weapons. If the other gas station was any indication, they needed to be prepared for battle. "You good?" Wallace asked. "Let's clear it out and get Chuck here. I'm ready to prop my feet up and relax," Palmer replied. Wallace nodded, and both of them stepped out from behind cover. While they didn't see any resistance, they did see something a lot more distressing. "Well, that's not ideal," Palmer remarked. The two men stared at the gas station, or what was left of it. The building was a burned-out shell. The pumps melted into the ground. The only thing still standing was a giant wooden sign at the edge of the parking lot. It read, "We will rebuild." Chapter 4. The two soldiers stood there, their faces reflecting their disappointment as they surveyed the scene. The other gas station lay in ruins, with no fuel for them to take. Private Palmer broke the silence, frustration in his voice. "So what in the hell do we do now?" Private Wallace shook his head, equally baffled. "I honestly have no idea." Palmer's mind raced, searching for a solution. Wallace didn't seem convinced. What good is that going to do? Palmer shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe we can drive it to our destination and hope they have some gas." "Yeah, and we'll just cart it back down here in 2-liter soda bottles." "That'll only take weeks," Wallace retorted. "Unless they have a fuel truck, then we could," Palmer replied. Wallace raised his hand to halt Palmer's suggestions, a spark of inspiration in his eyes. "Forget the fuel truck. What about a tow truck?" Palmer looked intrigued, but skeptical. "You know how to drive one of those things?" Wallace grinned. "No, but I'm betting our new friend just might." Palmer grabbed his radio. "Hey, Chuck, got a question for you." Chuck's voice crackled through the radio. Palmer inquired, "Do you know how to drive a tow truck?" Chuck hesitated, but then responded, "Not my favorite thing in the world to do, but if it's absolutely necessary." Palmer replied, "I think we're approaching that point." "So the other gas station didn't pan out," Chuck said. "Burned to the ground," Palmer confirmed. "I'll take that as a no," Chuck said. "They do plan on rebuilding, so maybe if we just wait around long enough," Palmer joked. "Given the two choices, I'm going to go with the tow truck one." "Have you found one big enough to tow my rig?" Chuck replied. "How big do we need?" Palmer asked. "Just get the biggest one they got. A town this size, this far out from big cities, is bound to have one to handle my truck," Chuck said. "What makes you say that?" "Trucks break down everywhere, and if you're the only game within 100 miles, you're gonna make bank," Chuck replied. Palmer chuckled ruefully. "Guess I picked the wrong career." Chuck agreed. "Looks like you did. Now you get me that truck and I'll get us to the destination." Palmer assured him, "We're on it. Hang tight." Palmer stowed the radio away and turned to Wallace. "Okay, Wallace, now where in the hell are we getting a tow truck?" Wallace pointed to the house behind him, prompting a puzzled look from Palmer. "Are they a tow truck driver?" Wallace reasoned. "Probably not, but they should have a phone book." "I mean, isn't that a small town thing to have?" Palmer smirked, acknowledging the logic, and signaled for Wallace to follow. They approached the house, peering through the window to ensure it was empty. Finding no signs of trouble, they entered. In the living room, an old recliner sat beside a landline phone resting on top of a phone book. Palmer couldn't help but shake his head. "It's like we're back in the 80s again." Wallace grabbed the phone book and quickly found what he was looking for. "Got it. Carver's Towing. 100 block of Foster Street." "Now, we just need to find out where Foster Street is," Palmer said. Wallace grinned as he flipped the book around, showing the ad for the tow truck. There was a small outline of the town with their location marked by a star. Fortunately, it was on the same side of town they were currently on. Palmer nodded. Let's do it then. Wallace and Palmer exited the house, swiftly moving towards their destination. The route was mostly clear, with only a couple of zombies in their way, whom they dispatched with ease using their blades. Finally, they spotted the tow lot, surrounded by an 8-foot-tall sheet metal fence topped with barbed wire. To complicate matters, a dozen zombies clamored by the front gate, trying to get inside. The two soldiers halted, seeking cover as they assessed their options. Palmer asked, "What do you think?" Wallace was clear about his preference. "I'm thinking I don't want to go through the front gate." Palmer took out his binoculars and examined the barbed wire. It seemed relatively thin, but still sharp. "Might take me a minute, but I'm pretty sure I can get through that with my knife." "How's your balance?" Wallace asked. Palmer replied with a hint of sarcasm. "Well, I was a cheerleader in college." Wallace appeared shocked. "Really?" "Hell no. Don't be stupid and don't ask stupid questions. Like, how is my balance?" "Who in the hell keeps track of that?" Palmer said, struggling to contain his laughter. Wallace teased him. "My guess is vertigo patients, the elderly, college cheerleaders." Palmer responded with a playful middle finger, and Wallace chuckled. "Can you cut the wire while on my shoulders?" Palmer agreed. "Yeah, I'll manage." They nodded and headed out the door, staying close to the building to avoid attracting the attention of the zombies by the front gate. They reached a side street, relieved to find it clear. Wallace hurried to the fence, turning around to help Palmer climb onto his shoulders. Palmer, at eye level with the wire, began cutting it with his knife. As he worked, he realized why there were so many zombies at the front gate. "Damn it," he muttered. Wallace asked, concerned, "What is it?" Palmer continued cutting the wire. "There's a dozen of those things inside." "Are they all at the front gate?" Wallace asked. "No, most are by what I have to assume is the office." "Do you see one of the big tow trucks?" Wallace asked. Palmer spotted a giant truck at the far corner. "Yeah, I got it. We'll just have to figure out a way to get into the building." Wallace had a plan. "I can take care of that. I'm going to boost you over, give you 2 minutes to get into position. Then I'm going to open fire at the ones at the front gate. That should pull the ones at the building away." "You know I can just shoot them, right?" Palmer said. "And what happens when you open fire and 30 more of those things come at you from the rest of the yard?" Wallace retorted. Palmer considered the options and finally relented. "Okay, you start shooting." Wallace grinned. "That's what I thought." "Where do you want me to pick you up?" Palmer asked. "Preferably right out front," Wallace replied. "But if it starts getting crowded, 1 block in whatever direction those things aren't coming down." "Copy that. 2 minutes and I'll be ready to go," Palmer said. Wallace gave Palmer one final boost, helping him reach the top of the fence. He waited patiently until Palmer had disappeared over the other side, all the while keeping his weapon at the ready and mentally counting down the seconds. Palmer, now safely on the other side, took a knee beside one of the cars, carefully assessing the situation. In front of a small, single-room building at the center of the lot, a dozen zombies lurked. Windows on the side facing him appeared small and challenging to navigate. If the zombies were congregated outside, there was a high likelihood that something inside was keeping them there. Palmer concluded that entering through the front door would be his safest bet. In his thoughts, Private Palmer strategized, "Get in, find the keys, get to the truck, and haul ass out of here. Sounds a lot easier than it is." Palmer scanned the area, searching for any signs of movement, but he couldn't spot any, though the lot had many hidden spaces. As 2 minutes passed, gunfire erupted from outside. From his vantage point, Palmer witnessed zombie heads exploding at the gate, and bodies hit the ground as the creatures started moving away from the building. With a sense of relief, Private Palmer encouraged himself. "There we go. Come on." After a few moments, a significant gap appeared between the zombies and the building. However, Palmer noticed creatures emerging from the back end of the lot near the large truck he needed. Sensing an opportunity, Palmer broke from cover and sprinted across the lot toward the building, holding his handgun and knife at the ready. As he reached the front of the building, he peered inside and spotted a zombie thrashing against a window. He attempted to open the door, but it was locked. Inside, the zombie slowly made its way toward him. Frustration in his voice, Private Palmer muttered, "Damn it. I don't have a choice." Using his handgun, he smashed the glass, allowing him to reach inside and flick open the lock. Palmer swung open the door and rushed inside with just enough time to raise his knife and drive it into the approaching zombie's head. Palmer turned and closed the door, but the sound of breaking glass had drawn the zombies back toward him. Undaunted, he locked the door and hurriedly moved behind the counter. Frantically scanning the area for the tow truck keys, Palmer couldn't find them. He exclaimed, "Come on, where are you? Where the hell are you?" Finally, he spotted an unlocked lockbox on the wall, containing half a dozen sets of keys, all with the tow company logo on their keychains. Palmer grabbed all of them and rushed out the front door, narrowly escaping the grasp of the first approaching zombie. He quickly reached the side of the building before turning his attention to the truck. Palmer raised his handgun and began firing at the creature standing between him and the truck. His aim was slightly off as he ran, but he managed to hit the ones obstructing his path, clearing the way. The soldier reached the truck, pulled himself into the cab, and slammed the door shut. Shortly afterward, he heard the zombies banging their decaying hands against the door. Private Palmer couldn't help but taunt, "Can't get me up here, assholes." Palmer took out the keys, attempting them one by one. Each unsuccessful turn led to him tossing the keys aside in frustration. Finally, he reached the last key, holding it up as he pleaded, "Please work. Please, if you do, I'll get you a really nice leather keychain. I'll even monogram it for you if I can find the tools." Palmer took a deep breath before inserting the key and turning it. The key didn't budge. Palmer let the frustration get the better of him, removing the key and throwing it to the side before unleashing a torrent of curses. Finally, he stopped when he noticed that there was something sticking out from the sunblocker above his head. He pulled it down, and a set of keys fell into his lap, prompting a smile. God, I love small towns. Palmer quickly inserted the key, turning it, and the engine roared to life. He popped the truck into gear and began accelerating through the lot. The creatures in front of him proved no match for the hefty vehicle, their bones shattering upon impact. As he approached the gate, Palmer pressed the remote button on the top, relieved to see that it was on battery power. The gate opened, revealing a pile of corpses on the ground, which he plowed right over. He stopped in the middle of the road, scanning the surroundings. Wallace jogged up to the door, jumped into the cab, and greeted Palmer. "Get your ass in here. Let's roll," Private Palmer urged. Wallace chuckled. That worked a whole lot better than expected, didn't it? Both men laughed as they drove out of town, heading back toward Chuck and the transfer truck. When they arrived, it didn't take long for them to get the transfer truck hooked up. As Chuck secured it, the two soldiers stood in the middle of the road, keeping an eye on the zombies in town. Most of the creatures had already moved past the main road toward the first gas station they had encountered. The others that passed by didn't pay much attention to the soldiers, as they were too far outside of town. Chuck finally gave a signal. "We're good to go. Let's load it up," he called out. The two soldiers got into the cab with Chuck, who shifted the truck into gear and began to pick up speed. Palmer studied the map and advised, "If you go 4 blocks up and hang a left, that'll put us on a straight shot to Indian Pine." Chuck nodded as he continued to accelerate. Wallace asked, "Is this thing strong enough to plow through those things?" Chuck replied, "It can, but let's hope the resistance is minimal." Wallace and Palmer nodded as they continued to drive, making the turn onto the road out of town, relieved to see that it was clear. It took them another hour before they reached their destination. a remote casino in the middle of nowhere. As they approached, a set of headlights flashed on and off, signaling them to stop. Chuck pulled up just before a makeshift barricade and rolled down his window as a guard approached. The guard questioned, "What in the world are you doing out in these parts?" Palmer leaned over Chuck to identify themselves. "I'm Private Palmer with the military. We heard that you were out here surviving and thought you could use a helping hand. We have food, medicine, and a whole truckload of goodies if you're interested." The guard nodded and radioed in. After a brief moment, he looked back at the cab and gave a welcoming nod. "Welcome to the Indian Pine Casino." Palmer nodded in acknowledgement, and they were granted access to the compound. As they drove in, Palmer and Wallace's eyes widened at the sight of the vast compound. It might not have been a top-of-the-line Las Vegas casino, but it was certainly a significant improvement compared to what they had been dealing with for the past couple of weeks. "I think we're home, brother," Private Palmer said with a sense of relief. "Damn straight we are," agreed Wallace. They exchanged a fist bump, solidifying their decision that this would be their last run. The end.